Yeah, so my name is Mads. I work at BankInvest, and I'm here to talk a little bit about how we use Mosek as part of our portfolio construction and risk analysis work on a daily basis. I should say that any views expressed here is of course entirely my own and not necessarily those of BankInvest. So just briefly, my background is a bachelor in economics, a master in statistics, and a PhD in finance. So I've sort of been doing a little bit of everything. I've been at the Copenhagen Business School, Department of Finance, since 2009, and I'm still there. And since 2019, I've also been working at BankInvest as portfolio manager, and that's the reason why I'm here today. To talk about the way we use Mosek and why we find it useful, and what thoughts we've been giving using Mosek towards choosing other alternatives. So just briefly about BankInvest. It is a mutual fund manager, so we have a whole series of different mutual funds. Each fund is investing in a specific universe, in a specific type of asset, mainly equities or fixed income. We are owned by 38 regional and national minor Danish banks. So basically it's most of the banks that you may know in Denmark, except for Danske Bank and Nordea. So they are our owners, and the basic idea is that for most of these banks, not all of them, but most of them, they're not in themselves big enough to hold a full asset management arm. And so we're sort of doing that job for them. So we're providing them with the products, and then they're selling the products in their local branches. And it has at least one big benefit, which is because they are our owners, so whatever profit we're making goes back to them. So there's a self-interest for them to be selling our products. So that gives sort of a certain stability in the inflows that we're getting. We are currently managing total a number of assets of 139 billion, and around 40% of that is in equities. And I am part of the global equities team, and I'll get back to a little bit more about that. So as I said, we're using Mosek as one of the tools in our daily business. Traditionally, BankInvest has been a sort of a bottom-up equity fund, at least on the equity side. It's been a bottom-up fund manager, meaning that people read balance sheets and news reports about companies, and then they decided on an opinion on any given company, and then they composed a portfolio based on that. So not a very quantitative strategy. But then back in 2019, BankInvest decided that they want to do some kind of quantitative investment approach, or they wanted to implement quantitative investments as well. So I started along with some other guys back in 2019, and we started building up an equity quant team. And at the moment, that accounts for around 27 billion of these 139 that are the total AUM. So what we do is that we have a series of databases, and then we do all kinds of things, either in R or in Python. So it's not sort of the infrastructure is not very sophisticated. It's using standard building blocks, and in those databases we put in market data, so that may be price, volume, turnover, whatever we deem relevant. Obviously company fundamentals, so all the numbers from the income statement and balance sheets, analysts' assessments of the company, and then a thing which is a growing element, which is the whole sustainability side of investment. You can't basically today talk about investments without taking a stand on sustainability, and the whole, just the the word sustainability, it's not even clear what that's supposed to mean. That's also sort of the area of sustainability is constantly growing, and so we have to take that into account. So we have a number of data points that relate to sustainability. And then we also internally compute a number of different factor series. So the factor approach to investing that was discussed before lunch, there we compute our own series of factor scores that we also put into the databases. And then we this is our building blocks for how to build our portfolios. There are two main types of portfolios that we do. We either do portfolios based on a factor approach, so that means we decide on some kind of weighting of a selected number of factors, and then we optimize that score given some constraints. And then the other is to track as closely as we can the given index, also subject to some kind of conditions. So it's a slightly different types of optimization problems, but I think both have been covered in what we've seen before lunch. So I'll try to clarify exactly how that relates to what Gabor and Michael said. In doing this, we quite early on obviously realized that if you want to do optimization and you have an investment universe of a reasonable size, then you can't do it by hand, so you need somebody to help you do the optimization. And the natural first try was to just look for the standard packages that we could find in either R or Python. And back then we started working only with R, so back then we didn't look into Python. So we looked for the various optimization options that were in R. I remember one of the first things we did was we found this package. I can't even remember the name of it, but it was, the way it worked was you submitted your problem, and then it was sent to some server, I think in Switzerland somewhere, and then it was crunched and then was sent back. And these Swiss guys, they were kind enough to also release on their website who were using this. And without a number of days, within very few days, we could see that we were basically using 90% of the capacity. So we figured out, okay, maybe this is not the way to go forward. And even if we sort of could do some of what we wanted to do that way, we still struggled to find tools in the standard packages that were that could accommodate our needs. So our problems. So either we're not good enough at formulating our problems, or they are just inherently too complex to be handled by these standard tools. And the complexity relates to the dimensionality. So Michael already talked about this issue, that you would normally have a number of assets in the thousands. The computational time cannot be too long. You cannot say to a customer, okay, we'll get back to you in a few days when the optimization has converged. And also in the number of constraints that you want to have in there, the way you want to control risk, and so on and so forth. So overall, the complexity is just too big for us to use the standard tools. So what was then an option? Then we tried to look into third-party providers. So Bloomberg, which is a financial data provider in many ways, they also have built-in optimization tools to use. In principle, I say in principle, but not in practice, I guess we could use their tool. The thing is that whenever you want to optimize something in their tool, you need to upload all of your data series. So it's extremely cumbersome and not very flexible. If we have a lot of data in our databases, then we have to use the web to upload our data series, combine them in their tool with the specifications that they have, and then optimize there. And then we only get the output. We don't get all the information that Michael showed us about how the optimization runs. So it's very hard to analyze the outcome. Another option is a system by BlackRock called Aladdin. They also have some optimization tools there, but the problem is essentially the same. It doesn't fit into our basic data structure. We want to do, or we need to do, a lot of optimizations, and it needs to work at a reasonable pace. It just gets too heavy, too slow, with moving all the data back and forth between the systems. And it's much harder to control exactly how the optimization is running. And in particular, obviously, when you want to launch a new investment strategy, you want to do some back testing. How did this perform during the past 5 or 6 years or 10 years or whatever? That requires a lot of optimization. Let's say you want to do it on a quarterly basis. 6 years, that's 24 optimizations. Essentially it's not a lot, but for each time you have to upload new amounts of data, make them fit this third-party provider system, and then wait for the output, it's just way too cumbersome. So we figured out that we had to look for another solution, and that's really how we got to Mosek. So that's what we're using today for parts of our optimization of portfolios. Not for all of them, but for those that requires it. And it works very well, at least we believe. It's easy to implement with all the existing data structure coding that we have, and we can more or less specify the problems the way we want them. I think the place where we still have a lot to learn is to be better at maybe specifying the problems, but also understanding the output of the optimization to make it run even more smooth and faster. But that's sort of the background for where we are today. So just a bit more about sort of the overall approach that we do when we construct portfolios. So we start by an initial screening. So we put a cap on how small companies we are willing to invest in. We have a number of procedures that sort of gives us red flags if there are certain things that we think we should worry about. And if we're too worried based on these red flags, then we discard the companies as well. We try to look at the size of the default risk of each company, whether there are signs of accounting fraud, whether the company is related to one or more of the controversial, what we term and others term controversial industries. So that could be tobacco, it could be oil and other different industries. We look at to what extent the companies comply with the UN Global Compact principles about labor and human rights, and what's the environment and anti-corruption. So we have some, obviously again, all of this requires data. So we need data on the UN principles, we need data on industries, we need data on all of these things in order to be able to screen for that. And then we also look at the ESG score. So this is a sustainability measure that says something about the sustainability of a company, sort of very broadly speaking. Then once we've been running these screens, that obviously reduces our investment universe. Then we look at our factors and we use them to come up with, if it's a factor optimization exercise, to come up with the objective function, which could be a weighting of, for instance, quality, value, and sentiment, three different factors. And then with constraints on ESG, on SDG, which is the the UN 17 sustainability goals, and on the carbon emission. So this is basically the objective function, and this will be the restrictions. And then we run an optimization subject to further. This is also restrictions, but they're related to the risk, because all of our funds have some kind of benchmark that we don't want to deviate too much from. And in order to do that, we put up restrictions on how much we're willing to deviate on a country or regional level compared to the benchmark, how much in terms of these or other factors we are willing to deviate from the benchmark. Maybe there are some macro risk factors that we also want to relate to, some company risk factors, industry risk factors, and maybe some further sustainability issues. So these are also additional constraints that we put into the optimization. Then we run the optimization here, and then we go through these points to see what comes out of it. Does it look reasonable, or should we change the optimization? So either then we go back and rerun, or we choose this as our final portfolio. So that's sort of in very broad terms the way we construct our portfolios. at least if we do the factor approach. Remember I said we have two sort of different types of portfolios. The one is based on factor optimization, the other is based on mimicking an index.
So you have two optimizations?
No, this is, two different sort of types of optimizations. And this is the ones describing the factor optimization.
What's the objective function there? Just maximizing expected return? Or?
No, that's maximizing the expected factor exposure.
Okay.
Or excess factor exposure, excess to benchmark. So that's just a linear function. So that's fairly easy. And we don't necessarily need Mosek for that unless we want to have some risk constraint added. But for the risk optimization, there we cannot get around it without using Mosek. So index tracking, there the overall goal is not to deviate too much from a given index, but usually with some additional constraints that's not accommodated in the index. So let's say we have an institutional mandate who says we would like to track overall world stock market performance, but we would like the portfolio to accommodate these additional things. So then our task is to track some kind of world index, but add some more constraints to that. So there's no tactical in that. That's just sort of trying to get as close to the index as possible with these additional constraints. Whereas here, it's based on a belief that these factors will drive long-term returns. I mean, so obviously it's always a matter of, we don't want to trade just to trade. So it's always a matter of how often do you want to rebalance. And I mean, obviously there's...
Do rebalance sometimes?
Yeah, sure. But that also relates to how many, how closely do you need or do you want to mimic? How many stocks do you have in your portfolio? I mean, if you have very few, then everything else equally will need to rebalance more often. So there are many issues that determine how often you do rebalance in practice.
And do you rebalance also with a factor investment, or just that's more like?
Yeah, everything is rebalanced at a certain frequency. Okay. And sometimes you see big movements in certain factors within a short time span. Then of course you need to rebalance more frequently.
Yeah. Are you maximizing for each factor then?
No, it's a composite score. It's a composite score, so it's a weighted.
Weigh them against each other?
Yes.
Okay.
So we decide on some kind of weighting scheme. Yeah. But then we may have some. These could also enter as constraints, saying we want some kind of weighting of these, but we want to make sure that there's no sort of this doesn't go like completely whack. So there could be some constraints on the individual factors as well. Again, because everything we do is related to some kind of benchmark. So we want to, as much as we want to believe that we see something that not everybody else sees, we still want to make sure that we don't deviate too much, and that also goes for the factors. Yeah, this is basically saying the same thing again in a more commercial way, I guess. So we put in some models, a lot of data, key figures from the balance sheet and market data, and then we add a layer of risk control, and then that's fed into sort of this cube here, which gives us an overall idea of the status of each company in our investment universe, and then that's sort of the starting point for everything that we do. And this is something just to give you an idea of what comes out of it. So here to the left, you see the factor exposures of one of our portfolios. So these are the factors, and the unit here on the y-axis, that's standard deviations, annualized. So these are the factors that we consider, and the full bars, that's the portfolio exposure, and the not so full bars, that's the benchmark exposure. So you can see that we attempt not to deviate too much from the benchmark exposure. So we're not trying to mimic benchmark exposure, we just want to check that we're not too far away. Again, as a risk mitigating approach. So that's one thing we do, and this is the actual picture of the actual invested portfolio for one of our funds. This is sort of more of an analysis tool. So here what we do is we take each factor and then we try to do a single factor optimization on that, and then run the performance of that. So if we with the value factor that we construct, which we called value BIQ, the excess return from benchmark year to date was, and each factor comes in a sort of a normal version and a sustainable version where there's added some more sustainability constraints to the portfolio. But there the excess return year to date is like 3-4% for the value factor. So this is sort of a way to try to get an idea of which factors are performing well at the moment. So in principle these two things are completely separate, although I mean you see it's the same factors, but here we sort of try to understand which factors are driving returns at the moment, or in this case year to date, whereas here we're looking at the actual exposure of our investment. Let me talk a little bit about this index tracking. So as I said, this is the other type of portfolio optimization that we do, and here the overall goal is to track a given index as closely as possible without creating too much turnover, and usually with some additional constraints compared to the index. So think about this as the benchmark will be like world stock market performance, and then we have a client saying we would like to track that, but we want this product to fulfill certain criteria with respect to carbon exposure, with respect to some other kind of sustainability measure. And then we add these constraints, and then we try to minimize this. So here we have the quadratic optimization function, and then we have some linear constraints. We not only have linear constraints, we also have binary constraints, because just as Michael talked about before lunch, in this case we want to be able to control the number of stocks that's in the portfolio. So it's not that it needs to be like 50 spot on, but it needs to be within a given range. So we need the binary constraints. So that gives us control over the number of stocks. We also, and they also help us control, so the stocks that end up in the portfolio, we want to put a lower bound on how little to invest in that. So again, just as the example that Michael showed us, if you don't do that, you will easily end up with some stocks with, I mean, essentially zero weight. So we put in a lower bound on the size of each stock in the portfolio. Then we want to make sure that each stock is also sort of reasonable in size compared to the benchmarks. We want to compare, or we want to have constraints that control over and underweight compared to benchmark, both at stock level and at the regional and sectoral level. We also want to make sure that the factor exposures are reasonably in line with the benchmark. So that's this figure here to the left. So we put up constraints that make sure that this holds. And then there's the whole sustainability thing. We can put up some restrictions that govern ESG, both at the single stock level, or basically the single stock level that we screen for before we put up before we formulate the optimization problem. But there is some overall bound on how low we allow the ESG score, the sustainability score of the portfolio to be. There's some overall bound on how low we allow the sustainability SDG UN score to be. There's an upper bound on the CO2 emission. And this may seem as just three restrictions on the portfolio level, which is just three linear restrictions, except that the ESG is in itself composed of a weighting of the E, S, and G score, so we may also have some constraints that relate to either E or S or G. Or we may want to control this individually at either region or sector level. So that adds also to the number of constraints. Maybe it's more important, the E may be more important in some sectors than others, so we could control for that. The same goes for the SDG and the CO2. And ESG is not just ESG, as well as SDG is not just SDG. It comes in both gross and net terms. and the CO2 emissions comes in various forms as well. It can be measured relative to sales, it can be measured relative to size, and various other ways. So this can be a huge pile of constraints, depending on exactly what it is that you want your portfolio to be. Then we may also want to control turnover, and one sort of very simple reason for that is that, as I said, we're owned by small local Danish banks mainly, and we post frequently the holdings of our funds on our website. And if these customers that have bought our products, they should happen to go by our website and see that the names on the holdings list changes too frequently, then they may want to ask what exactly is going on. So, so for the sheer size of commercial presentability, we want to sort of have a cap on the turnover. And then again, there can be some nuts and bolts related to specific stocks. Do we want to hold both the A and B share? Do we want to hold both the ADR if it's a foreign stock, non-US stock, or the local stock? These things we can also accommodate here. So mixed integer is for us the only option. So even though we heard today, and I can only confirm that, at least in our framework, that it's not an easy problem to solve, that is, in our case, the only viable option. It's the only thing that we can make use of. And this is where we sort of deviate from what has been said today. What both Gaber and Michael said about factor investing was a factor structure of the covariance matrix. And we don't do that. We don't put a factor structure on the covariance matrix when we do this, because we want as good an estimate of the risk of each individual security in the investment universe, and that would simply require too many factors. So at least for now, we don't use the factor structure. I guess going forward, we'll probably introduce some factor structure as an addition to what we do today, but today we don't, and that just means that it's definitely not a sparse covariance matrix that we're dealing with, which obviously only makes things more complicated. So what we do is we try to sort of to come up with what we believe is a reasonably stable way of estimating both correlations and the individual risks, and then put that together. But I mean, this is definitely work in progress. Let me put it that way. But the numbers that we get out so far, we think look reasonable, and obviously also when we compare to commercial risk systems, we sort of try to make sure that we're not too far away from that. But we build it pretty much from the bottom up. Yeah. And relating dimensionality to the optimization, let's say that we have an investment universe of these, like just 4,000, like Michael said, is a reasonable number. And then with the binary constraints, then we are at 8,000. So it is really a problem that takes some time to solve. And that's also why we also, at least currently, implement some of these sort of stop measures that Michael talked about, either running time or some other ways of sort of make sure that it doesn't go out of whack. And obviously also, to the extent possible, try to provide a reasonable input value, a starting value. So what are the challenges? I guess we've talked about it. One big challenge for us is, of course, specification of the covariance matrix, because that works as input, and that's basically given in the optimization. So we want it to be rich enough to accommodate, to be able to capture the risks of most stocks in our universe, but still robust enough to not change too much or too frequently. We need the optimization to run reasonably, we need it to be able to accommodate a lot of constraints. We need it to run reasonably fast because, as I said, just the sustainability constraints, they can be put together in so many ways that if we want to test different settings, then running time of an hour is just not enough. It's just infeasible, because then let's say we have 20 different scenarios that we want to test, then that's a day's work. So obviously that doesn't work. So we need it to run reasonably fast, and that also means that we're not aiming for a global solution. We are aiming for finding a a decent, feasible solution. And then obviously check that the constraints are not obviously, as Michael showed us, check that the constraints are satisfied, but also check that what comes out of the optimization seems to be, we can't know how far we are from the global optimum, but that it looks reasonable what comes out of it. We want some kind of stability in the optimization. Again, we can't present to our customers that, today our perception of risk is just completely different from yesterday. So even though we may forego some kind of optimality, it's better to stay local, and of course to some extent we ensure that by if possible providing a decent starting point. And then there's an issue that we're still struggling a lot with, or not sure exactly what to think about. Some people believe that putting more constraints is a good thing, because the more you constrain your problem, the easier one may think it is to find a solution, the less options there are. On the other hand, at least in this mixed integer setting, I'm not sure that's exactly the case. So I think that's one of the things that we're still struggling with, to figure out what's an appropriate number of constraints. Going back to constraints, for instance, like these, do we gain anything if we put these at either sector or regional level, or should we just stay at the overall portfolio level? Do we gain anything in terms of control and speed in terms of optimization? So as part of what we do here, we obviously do some kind of we have some kind of PCA element in there. So you could say that we implicitly have some kind of, or enforce some kind of factor structure. But I think my impression is that we use more PCA factors than sort of what is commonly used. So we could take the raw covariance matrix and then just take the first 3 of 10 factors. We use somewhat more. So I think we're not, in that sense, doing it the classical way. But obviously, it would be natural to investigate that further, and that is something that we will need to look more into. But no, the short answer is no, we haven't done that yet. The only thing we've basically done is make this work, and then try to compare the risk numbers that come out of this with the risk numbers that we can see in, for instance, Aladdin or Bloomberg, and sort of see, are they ballpark the same? And they seem to be. Yeah, that was it, actually.